How many fingers am I holding up this?
4.
And if the party says there are not 4, but 5, then how many?
5.
We are living in the era of the big lie. America is fundamentally racist. Men are women. Abuse is love. The big lie works because we don't expect it. We can't imagine telling someone the opposite of the truth with a straight face, so we can't imagine that anyone else would. But they do, and they do it daily. We'll look behind the big lies about race, sex, and mental health this week on Disaffected.
Reality is in the human mind, not in the individual mind, which makes mistakes and soon perishes, but in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal.
Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we talk about politics and culture through a psychological lens. And as usual, we have some housekeeping at the top of the show here. Last week, we talked about the psychiatrist who was asked to do a grand rounds lecture at Yale University named Aruna Kilanani. And you may recall she talked about having fantasies of unloading a gun into white people's heads and walking away with a bounce in her step, like she did the world a fucking favor, I quote. I was mistaken about something. She is not a Yale psychiatrist. She is not employed by Yale. She was invited to give a grand rounds lecture to medical school students at Yale, but she is not a degreed psychiatrist at Yale. I'm not sure where she got her credentials from, but wanted to clear that up. And I gave some thought to some comments that we got last week on the show. And a couple of people were, talking about the National Geographic Race Card Project. And to refresh you, National Geographic, the famous magazine, did a campaign called the Race Card Project, where they asked people who had an issue to talk about in terms of race and race relations in America to send a picture to National Geographic and a 6-word description to put on their race card. And I went through about 4 or 5 of them, and they all struck me as attention-seeking, frankly, narcissistic ploys by people who wanted to be either perceived as victims of ongoing and daily racism or ongoing and daily exoticization if the person was a non-white, non-European person. And if they didn't want to be seen as victims, some of them wanted to be seen as sort of cultural heroes for being aware of their white privilege and trying to educate their benighted and ignorant family members who didn't want to hear it. I'm not being very charitable to my critics here because I'm just repeating how I felt about it last time. But a couple of people said they thought that I was a little bit too caustic, that I had not given some of the people who participated in the project enough credit. And a few people pointed out that they too had had experiences like the ones that were described by the people that I featured on the show, either women getting ogled by men, catcalled by men, people being asked, where you're from if they didn't look non-white. And I want to give that its due. I do understand that this happens to people. I'm not trying to say no woman has ever been catcalled. No woman has been harassed on the street. No person of color has ever been looked at funny or treated like a non-American. I do recognize that these things happen. On the other hand, what I think about this is that when there is a project like what National Geographic put together, it tends to select people who are very self-regarding. These are people who want attention. And of course, I can't prove this, but my opinion about this remains the same. I do think that these people are probably exaggerating. I do think they are elevating these experiences into something more dramatic than it necessarily needs to be. And I think they do it because we are living in a culture where you can make a very good social living by being a victim. And especially if you fit into one of our favorite victim categories. Today, women, LGBTQIA alphabet soup, people of color, people of non-majority religions. Again, I'll give you some of it. I know that these things happen to people. On the other hand, I don't think that they are nearly as dramatic, probably, nor nearly as frequent as people who respond to these sorts of things tend to say that they are. And the other side of it is also, I'm not these people's therapist. That's not my job here. I'm a commentator, and I'm sometimes sarcastic, and I like to poke fun at excess. So I'm going to be poking fun at excess. Maybe I was a little bit uncharitable, but I think it's okay too. So let's get into this show. As I was putting this together this week, I was just struck by the fact that no matter where I turned, if I turned on mainstream news, if I looked at social media, if I watched what people were talking about, everything lately seems to be about race relations when it comes to the American discourse. And we've talked about the fact that so-called critical race theory is making its way into public and private school curricula. And critical race theory, the quick and dirty way to understand that, the proponents will often describe it as anti-racism, but it's much, much more than just anti-racism. It has some fundamental beliefs, and those fundamental beliefs are that race relations and that awareness of race are fundamental to every interaction at whatever scale you want to look at here in America. If it's white and black people, race is underneath that. If it's white people and people of color, of any particular color, that there is always an undercurrent of power, and power that is based on race, and power that is assigned differently based on your skin color. It's basically turning up any potential conflict up to 11. And in my view, it's creating an idea that there is a crisis of racism and violence where it doesn't actually exist. And again, there's no need to split. It's not a black and white issue. That doesn't mean that racism isn't real. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen to some people. But I don't believe it's accurate to say that racism is the foundational condition that structures all of our conversations in this country. Well, I'm in the minority because this is held up as obvious on its face by the left, by Democrats. And if you're a Democrat on the left and you don't believe that, hey, I'm glad to know you. I know there are a lot of you out there, but your voices aren't being heard by the Democrats. And if you're just being silent about this, don't get angry at somebody like me for pointing out that this is a mainstay of the left. If you don't want it to be, I'm not the problem for being the messenger. You need to talk to your leaders or roust some of them. I saw an article, I've seen some discussion by therapists, mental health researchers, mental health professionals. I get contacted by some of them. They show me examples of the kinds of continuing education that they're being given. And there is a real push to inject critical race theory or critical race consciousness into the therapeutic relationship between a counselor, a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst, and their client or their patient. And we've got two examples of that today. And the first one comes from a paper that was published in May, last month, May of 2021. The title of the paper is Talking with White Clients About Race. And it was published in the May 2021 version of the Journal of Health Services Psychology. And if you're watching this on video, I want you to look at this title. And I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. I want you to look at the title and see if you can figure out what's unusual about it. Did you see it? Notice the capitalization. Generally, when you do titles for pieces like this, each word is capitalized. The only word in this title that is not capitalized is the word white. So we've got talking with white clients about race. Every word is capitalized except white. Yeah, I think that's a tell. They are so concerned. Wait, let me back up a little bit. You may have noticed, if you don't know this, journalistic style books like the Associated Press Style Guide have updated their guidelines to instruct journalists to capitalize the word black, to make it a proper noun. They have not instructed them to capitalize white. And no, I'm not jealous. I don't need to have the word describing my skin color capitalized to feel included. What I'm pointing to here is this is the deification of a particular group of people for political purposes. And it's sinister. The fact that they will go so far as to actually break orthographic convention in terms of journal titles to show you that white people are in lowercase tells you something about what they want to do. And this paper tells you even more directly. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm going to give you, let me read you the abstract. Most white people do not believe that race is an important feature of their lives, and this belief continues into the therapy room where race is rarely a topic of conversation, especially for all white dyads. Breaking away. A dyad is just two people. It's psychologists speak. However, research shows that race and racism are highly salient for white people's mental health, and this gap in understanding has negative effects on the well-being of both white people and people of color. This paper argues to embrace the ethical and moral call to actively address race and racism in therapy between white therapists and white clients. This embrace can be particularly challenging for white therapists who believe themselves to be social justice-oriented people, but who nevertheless contribute to racism in both conscious and unconscious ways. A model is offered for how psychotherapists can bring up and work with the topics of race and racism during the course of therapy. There's more to it, but that's enough to give you a flavor. Notice some of the assumptions that are, well, no, they're not smuggled in. I was going to say smuggled in, but they're not smuggled in. They're right there. They're unproven assumptions. They're simply assertions. This embrace can be particularly challenging for white therapists who believe themselves to be social justice-oriented people, but who nevertheless contribute to racism in both conscious and unconscious ways. How do they know that? How do the authors know that? We're not told. We are expected to assume this. This is why people talk about critical race theory and critical race consciousness as a religious or cult-like philosophy, because it is. It has articles of faith that do not have to be proven. And in fact, the atmosphere is so hostile to people with questions that asking that question, how do you know that white therapists are contributing to racism consciously and unconsciously? How do you know that for their clients, race has a significant and daily impact on their mental health? You can't ask that question because you're supposed to take this on faith. And if you ask the question, that only shows that you are even more blind and even more racist than they thought at the beginning. This doesn't bode well. So, like many papers, they use a vignette, a case study, a vignette. And little vignettes like this, I actually love reading these. These are some of the fun parts of psychological papers. They just basically create a composite character of a client in a believable way, in a way that's believable to the authors, that they think that people reading this will recognize. And then they go about and say, how would we offer treatment to this person? So I'll read you some of the vignette that they use here as an example. Jeff is a white 49-year-old city councilor in a liberal city in Oregon. Sorry, of course he is. Everybody knows we're talking about that shithole Portland, which might as well be Mogadishu now. 49-year-old counselor in a liberal city in Oregon where he's worked for the past 10 years. He has come to see you because of depressed mood and anxiety related to changes in his work life that have caused him additional stress. He reports that he's always been a very hard worker and he cares deeply about his city where he's lived most of his life. He has a strong drive to succeed at his job as a city councilor because he wants to create a better city, etc., etc. Claims that he's never been to psychotherapy before, hasn't considered it. Recently, one of his friends from work mentioned having sought psychotherapy during college, and his wife has been encouraging him to try it because of his changes in mood and conflicts at home. Jeff comments that he feels unappreciated at his job for the first time in his life due to public conflicts that are atypical of his city, where people, quote, usually get along and are very supportive of each other. He points to the summer of 2020 and the uprisings around racial injustice and police brutality as the point where, quote, half the city turned against me because of the arrests of protesters that were happening in the city, a reaction that is causing him great distress and that he feels is very unfair toward him. While he admits that a lot of the issues being brought up are unfamiliar, especially when hearing from marginalized communities, he tells you that he has always been dedicated to ensuring that everyone in the city is treated equally. He says despite his new efforts to hear from the city's most marginalized citizens, many people are angry at him and don't seem to care about his years of hard work. He's especially upset that people are calling him a racist simply because of his public support of the police department. Okay, so Jeff here in our vignette. There are some assertions and assumptions in here, and I think you can pick them out. But I think that the description here of somebody like Jeff, in the main, is pretty plausible. I can imagine that there are a lot of people feeling like that. I've felt like this. Some of you have felt like this. People who have spent most of their life on the political left, voting Democrat, voting for what we consider to be social justice issues, have found ourselves all of a sudden being under a microscope and being looked at as crypto-racists at best, right? And at worst, as conscious racists who are just simply pretending that we're not enjoying our white privilege. These are these assumptions again. They don't have to be proven. They merely need to be asserted. And the assumptions that these people make in this vignette are very troubling. Because it's phrased in such a way as to inject doubt in the reader's mind about whether or not Jeff is being truthful about what he represents to you. Let me give you an example. Jeff is intentional about mentioning that he is a lifelong Democrat like most people in his city, but that he feels for the first time in his life that he's being criticized for his handling of social justice issues. He's intentional about mentioning that he's a lifelong Democrat. Maybe I'm reading into this a little bit. It's possible. But this puts a flag up in my head, and it sounds to me like somebody who is saying, Jeff is trying to do impression management with you, his therapist. He's intentional about mentioning that he's a Democrat, as if this were a manipulation rather than an honest expression of bafflement and frustration. Let's take Jeff at his word. Let's say that Jeff is a lifelong Democrat. Let's say he is a city councilor in Portland and that he has voted in ways that support leftist solutions to perceptions of racial and economic injustice. Is he being manipulative by intentionally saying, hey, because of this, this is why I'm baffled that people are reacting to me this way? I don't think that's unreasonable. And I thought it was also interesting that he mentions in the vignette that he is distressed that people are upset with him because he supports the police department. You can see a lot of that these days. Anybody who says all cops are not bastards, contrary to the hashtag ACAB, all cops are bastards, is assumed to be supportive of racist policing. Yeah. So, as this paper goes on, it becomes really clear that what's going on here is the authors are digging for racial offenses. They're digging for original racial sin. It's not possible that that racial sin isn't there. It's not possible that after they dig, they won't find what they're looking for. They assume it. And you can tell as you read on. So they start laying out the theoretical framework that they're going to take this from by citing others in the field. Example. Many lay people incorrectly define racism as the explicit endorsement of racial bias. While this type of, quote, old-fashioned racism is less prevalent today, scholars posit that racism has shifted into more subtle and underground forms since it is no longer culturally endorsed to express explicitly racist ideas. That's it right there. Oh, you just have an old-fashioned idea about racism. You know, your old-fashioned idea is that somebody calls a black person the N-word, or somebody makes a joke about fried chicken or watermelon. Well, we don't do that anymore, but since racism is always there and will always be there, it's part of the white character structure, we need to dig deeper to find where this racism is actually hiding. You know, claiming to be a liberal and citing your political record of supporting non-white people is evidence of racism. Oh, I meant to pull this out. Let's see if I did it. I didn't pull the quote, but there was one sentence in there that talked about the fact, made the assertion that white forms of culture and white ways of relating to other people are favored at the expense of non-white ways of relating to people and non-white examples of culture and arts. Really? What about the widespread nature of rap and hip hop in popular music? This is the stuff that's on the top of the charts for young people. I mean, if you listen to pop music at all, and of course I don't listen to it as much as I used to, that's a game for young people. But when I turn on Top 40 radio these days, the proportion of the kinds of pop music that I was used to listening to in the 1980s, basically melodic pop rock, there's a much lower proportion of it today than there is what used to be called urban contemporary rhythm and blues that we now call hip hop and sometimes rap. I mean, it has really exploded in popularity. Look at the fact that who do kids in high school idolize? Rappers and hip hop artists. And this is across the board. Black people, white people, Latinos, and others. I question the idea that so-called white forms of culture and art are necessarily held up as the standard at the expense of other things. I don't really see that going on, at least not in the United States. Oh, here it is. I just got ahead of myself a little bit. Because everyone in the United States has been raised in a society that values white cultural markers over non-white ones. Everyone holds some degree of racial bias. Again, asserted but not demonstrated. There's two assertions there. Society values white cultural markers over non-white ones. We're left to wonder what those are, but I think they're talking about artistic and cultural expression. That's one. Number two, everyone holds some degree of racial bias. Do they? Really? Prove it. They don't. Then we get to, it's a very long paper, and believe me, I'm only giving you some of it. Next topic heading, racism's relevance to whites' mental health. Before beginning this section, it's important to acknowledge that the negative effects of racism on white people's lives are not to be compared to the negative effects of racism on the lives of people of color. And there's more in that paragraph. They spent an entire paragraph pre-defending the fact that in this paper they were going to talk about a therapist's ethical duty to a white client. Basically, they were apologizing for taking the white client's feelings into account and making sure to say, we understand that whatever pain a white client faces is much, much lower and cannot be compared to the pain of a person of color. I think this is offensive, and I question how any therapist could approach a client this way with anything resembling the idea of unconditional positive regard, which is one of the mainstays of the therapeutic approach. You know, treating that other person as important for that hour that you're with them and letting them speak to you authentically in a completely transparent and honest way. I don't like the assumptions that such a therapist would bring into the therapy relationship that they talk about here. And they gild the lily. Here's another quote. The violence that white racism has inflicted on people of color is beyond measure, and the negative effects of white people's own racism on themselves is not comparable. The intent here is merely to address the negative effects of white racism on white people so that mental health professionals can more readily work with it in therapy. They give more theoretical support. Researcher Janet Helms submitted, like many other critical race theorists, that racial identity permeates every aspect of one's daily life and relationships. Thus, working with race is not only critical in the therapy room, but it is active and influential in every relationship one has. Want a little more? They go a little bit further back in time to Frantz Fanon. Fanon's psychoanalytic conceptualization of race renders whiteness a condition that is not only incapable of rational thought, but one that corrupts white people's souls. This is a theorist that they're drawing from. Does that sound familiar? It should. If you watched the show last week with psychiatrist Aruna Kilanani talking about the fact that the white mind is essentially psychopathic. Should these people be given a couch for people to become clients on? Whew. So there's a lot more, but I want to take you to what they suggest. The whole meat of this paper and all of this backstory about the essential deranged and corrupted character or soul of white people is in service of developing a model that they think that therapists have an ethical duty to take into the therapy room with them with white clients. So let's put up the first image here. I'll read them out to you. It's a model that includes 5 steps. 5-step model for addressing white racism in the therapy room. Number 1, therapists must go through the process of building their own competency and racial consciousness so they can later work on it with their clients. What if that's not their client's problem? What if their client is coming to you for relief from obsessive compulsive disorder or a major depressive episode? What does race have to do with this? Number 2, second, therapists must create a holding environment that validates their client's experience, improves the relationship, and prepares the dyad to explore the racialized and often unconscious nature of their topics in therapy. Really? Really? The racialized nature of their topics in therapy. You see how there is no possibility that race is not a factor in the therapeutic relationship, that the client's problems may not have anything to do with race? 3, third, therapists can facilitate an exploration of the client's racial consciousness and history with topics around race. Why? Should a therapist be trying to facilitate, or rather create and build something that is not necessarily there? Number 4, in order to have longer-term success, therapists must find ways to connect the racialized topics in the client's life to their presenting concerns. Presenting means the symptoms that people describe and display when they come to a professional. So they have to find ways to connect the racialized topics in the client's life to their presenting concerns. I'll save this until I get past number 5. Finally, the client must embark on a long-term process of continuing their psychoeducation in pursuit of greater racial consciousness. This model will be applied to the case vignette to address how to discuss race with white clients in a productive and therapeutic manner. This is not therapy. That is not therapy. It is so clear that the goal here is for the therapist to work out his or her pet topics and political hobby horses at the expense of a therapeutic relationship with their client. If a client comes to you and wants to talk about ways that they are upset about, confused by, uncertain how to react to race dynamics at work, at home, well, certainly, absolutely, you should address those with the client. But you don't bundle in and drag in this assumption that what's going on here, whatever the client is presenting to you, is because they have no racial consciousness or they have unresolved white racism underlying everything that they're doing. I have to ask here, Do they even understand that they're in a relationship with a client? Whose purpose are these therapists to serve? If someone is to follow their suggested model, who is getting the service here? I would say it's not the client. I think the therapist is servicing him or herself. This is an abrogation of a basic ethical duty in therapy. It's unethical, it's immoral, it's inaccurate, and it's not therapeutic. Come back after the break. We're going to look at how the Washington Post talks about a similar topic about injecting race into everything on the other side. See you then. Hey, listeners, we now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us. And thank you. Welcome back. Before we get into this segment, I want to remind you, of course, that we have a website where you can find everything you want that is disaffected. Go to disaffected.fm. You will find all the platforms that we are on with video and audio, YouTube, Rumble. If you are an audio listener, and I am, take us along in the car. I listen to podcasts in the car constantly. Check us out on iTunes. Check us out on Spotify, Pandora, wherever you get your audio podcasts. And if you listen to us or watch us, thank you very much. Please remember, when you're on your platform, subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. Those numbers actually matter. They do help the algorithm, and they do help us. So if you could subscribe, we'd really appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to those of you who have signed up to donate. We are, you can support us through PayPal. You can support us through Patreon. You can support us through Subscribestar. And all you need to remember for that is disaffected.fm. Once you get there, there are links to all of those platforms. You don't have to remember any special URLs. And those of you who have signed up, thank you so much. You are helping to pay for this show as we get it off the ground. And I want you to watch your email box. You're going to get an email from me because I'm going to be organizing a Zoom hangout so that we can get to know each other just for supporters of the show. I'm not exactly sure when it's going to be, but within the next week or two, and I'll pick a weekend time and try to get it in there so that it's people on either side of the country and maybe some other countries can come join us. So watch your email box, and thanks, folks, for supporting us. So this this entire show is about race nonsense. Every time I put the notes together, I kept finding more and more and more, and it was very clear that I needed to talk about all of this. The Washington Post, just like all of the other legacy media, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, NPR is one of the worst offenders. It is all race, all social justice, all the time, wall to wall. It must be making them money. It must be getting them subscribers, or it must be serving some other purpose that is not apparent to me, because not only are they not backing off on any of this and not letting any dissent come across the airwaves or in print at all without accusing dissenters of being crypto-racists, but they're digging even deeper. The Washington Post has a new video series called The New Normal. I guess it's part of them building back better. Take a look at this.
Floyd's death became a deeply personal and racial tragedy for many Americans. For the first time, white people were becoming aware of their whiteness and the systemic ways that white supremacy affects all of us. In this episode, we're tackling white racial identity and why understanding your whiteness is integral to becoming self-aware as a white person. I'm Nicole Ellis, and this is The New Normal.
The more you kind of dive into that, the more I'm really realizing how deeply rooted racism is into like my everyday thought process. No matter how much you work at that, there's still even almost more work to be done.
White accountability groups are really helpful in terms of having a place to process, having
a group of people whose responsibility it is to call me on things or to challenge me.
We're unpacking wrong things that we've been taught in history class. I realized that I needed to go back and unpack and reorganize everything that I had learned because it was completely through a white lens. Most of us in doing this work have experienced this, where there's a period of deep shame for being white and for acknowledging the harm that our ancestors have caused. And that's a very legitimate piece of this work. And we can't ask people of color to hold our hands through the shame piece. That needs to happen with other white people.
I don't have the ability to like inherently name things as upholding white supremacy or as being racist. My whiteness is going to show up at different points in my life and at different points in different relationships.
Everything I thought about how I existed in my white body in the world was very wrong. And I needed this new lens to see the world through. So I think that's been a big piece of my own work.
We're going to continue to cover topics like this in the coming weeks.
Okay, I'm going to get the snark out of the way first. Their voices, I can't stand listening to them. I cannot stand it. It's the intonation, it's the voice. People are becoming aware of their whiteness for the first time. And every time you look, there's almost even more work to do. And I can't name things because of my whiteness is going to show up. And I realize that I have to unpack things. And it's partially Valley Girl, but that upspeak, the up intonation, drives me up the fucking wall. I cannot stand it. And I want to point out something else here too. I mean, this is, do you notice that one of those, I don't know who everybody in that video was, but you know, certainly they all gave the impression that they are people who work in some kind of human services field, perhaps therapy, perhaps something else. But you saw that they were all white women, right? Liberal white women. This is like, it's like a sticky trap. It's like a roach motel. You check in and you never check out. These white women check in and they never check out of this stuff. And I'm trying to figure out how to critique them and make fun of them at the same time and be fair. It really drives me crazy. This is an example of what I've talked about on several episodes before. The high level of agreeableness that is more typically female is on display here. This is the kind of thing that liberal, left-leaning white women are extraordinarily vulnerable to. You can convince them that they haven't been doing a good enough job, they haven't been a good enough therapist, they haven't been a good enough mommy, they are not caring for enough children, their heart isn't big enough. This is really a vulnerability to these people. And I think that once they get sucked into this, it's not just that they're vulnerable to being told that they are the source of someone else's problems, and they are. I mean, these are the kind of people that you can get them to apologize to somebody if he stepped on her foot. She will say, "I'm sorry." That's who these people are. But it's not just that. They're getting something out of this, I would guess. They're getting some ego validation. This may appear very humble, and there's a part of it that I think is perhaps an excessive amount of self-doubt and humility, a rather embarrassing excessive level of humbleness. But there's a part of it that's very boastful too. It's humble bragging. It's, look how enlightened I am. Look what a good-hearted woman I am, that I am willing to sit down in front of a camera for the Washington Post and narrate my sins to you and admit to you that I have so much work to do and I'm just going to keep doing it and it'll never be enough and I'll never be done. They're getting some narcissistic supply out of this, being seen as the best possible mommy. It's gross. It's just gross. You notice one of them was a trauma therapist? Yeah. I didn't used to... It's been pointed out to me by my therapist and some other people that you should be skeptical of somebody who says they are a trauma therapist, because there are many different techniques that a therapist can use to address trauma. One of them might be cognitive behavioral therapy. Another is standard psychodynamic therapy, talk therapy. But mental health professionals whose opinions I respect have said, there isn't really such a thing as a trauma therapist. Most people coming to therapy, not all, but most people will have some issues of trauma if they find themselves in a therapist room. And the solution to that is just called therapy, not trauma therapy. It's just therapy. So something to look out for. And, I guess it's a little thing, but I felt like I had to point it out too. This doesn't feel journalistic to me. It feels commercial. It's probably hard to see because we're reproducing a video. But if you watch this video on your own screen, take a look. The host, I can't remember her name, but when she was looking at the laptop, they were doing a shot of her and a reaction shot, and they were showing what she was looking at. They had inserted the image of the other person onto her laptop screen. It's I don't know if they still call it that in the days when they had to do this with physical cardboard. This was called inserting with a mat. You'd take an image and superimpose it on another. You often see this in it's sloppier in old science fiction movies where they insert a filmed view of the outside of a spaceship into the hole that a window is in. It looks overly produced. It looks commercial. It looks like an infomercial. It doesn't look like journalism to me. It's because it's not journalism. And I want to pull out one other thing that one of the interview subjects said on camera. There's almost always more work to be done. That's the point. The work is never done. The racism at the heart of the white soul can never be fully expunged. There will always be more. You will always have to do the work. You will always have to say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." You will always have to mortify yourself. You will always have to wear a hair shirt. This is cult dynamics. This isn't enlightenment. It's not honesty. It's a mortification cult. I have another video for you. This one, well, you'll be able to see. Kevin, let's cue mommy up, shall we?
So this morning, the baby woke up and had some sort of violence in her heart. I don't know what it was, but she has been losing her mind all day. And it's interesting because I'm watching her lose her mind, and then I'm watching the preteen respond to that by trying to make her happy. And I have had to actively tell him, stop trying to make her feel better, stop responding to her tears. It's so interesting to see the conditioning of people responding to white girl tears happening so early. She's 5, and she's got an 11-year-old coming after her trying to make her feel better when she cries. We have to unlearn this whole business that white women crying is going to get them what they want in life, because that ain't it.
Ooh, that video was from TikTok, and I actually saw it on an account called Libs of TikTok, as in liberals of TikTok. So thank you, Libs of TikTok. You open my eyes to things almost every day that I never wanted to know were real. Where to start with this? That's lunatic. That's just lunatic. And I know, it's obvious to you that it's lunatic, and it's obvious to most people that it's lunatic. Why I think this is noteworthy is it's an example of how a cultural milieu, a a certain era that is characterized by certain sensibilities, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of talking that become normalized and held up as the way you're supposed to have public dialogue, how that cultural milieu can make space so it can hold space, can make it acceptable for very antisocial and unacceptable behaviors to be paraded in public as virtuous acts. I find it very disturbing that this woman feels comfortable enough in our culture to videotape this and to upload it to her social media. She feels comfortable talking about her 5-year-old child this way. Even if you say, hey, Josh, that's really obvious. Anybody who sees that would see it's lunatic. I agree with you. I agree that most people would. I don't agree that everybody would. There are people out there, I've seen them praise this. I know that it's obvious to most people, but she feels comfortable. This is like, well, it's another version of what's going on with the proud parents of trans kids, right? When you see mothers, and it is almost always mothers, sometimes it's fathers. We've talked about a couple examples of that, but this seems to be largely something that abusive mothers do, not the favorite tactic of abusive fathers, who parade their children around. Jazz Jennings, for example, his mother, that woman who strikes me as psychopathic, who signed her family up to be filmed for 3 or 4 seasons on a show called I Am Jazz about her so-called transgender daughter. Jazz Jennings is a boy who was raised as a girl from the age of around 6 years old, if I remember correctly. And finally got what we used to call sex change surgery. And it was a botched sex change surgery. It took 4 surgeries to construct a false vagina for Jazz. And there was so little tissue left to work with because Jazz had been put on puberty blockers. You know, the puberty blockers that just press the pause button to give you time? No, they don't. He never developed full male genitalia. His penis never grew. He was left with a micropenis. So they had to make his false vagina out of stomach lining and pieces of his colon. And his family filmed this. And his mother parading him around. This is pageant parents. We look at the Ramseys, the John Benet Ramsey case, the little girl who used to be taken to pageants who ended up murdered and the murder was never solved. We can see this sort of stuff and say this is horrendous parenting, this is child abuse. But when you put the word trans in front of it, all of a sudden people can't see what is obvious Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is literally making a healthy child sick with medical abuse that includes poisoning by chemicals that are not good for their body, all the way up to mutilating and permanent surgery that leaves them sterile. Suddenly we can't see this because trans is normalized. This is just helping trans kids. Well, this is the same thing here, because talking about white privilege and how racist the white heart is, or the psychopathic white mind, if you prefer, is so normalized that this woman feels comfortable. Listen to what she actually said. I pulled some of these out because I want to go through them. She's talking about a 5-year-old here who's crying. She woke up with some kind of violence in her heart. Violence? A 5-year-old crying is crying because she has violence in her heart? Are you sure it's not because she slept bad? Because she hasn't had her breakfast? Because she had a bad day at kindergarten? 5-year-olds cry. This little girl, I don't need to know who this little girl is to know that she doesn't have violence in her heart. And if she does, then it's no different than whatever violence lives in the heart of any 5-year-old. It's funny and it's not funny. Children, yeah, let me give you a few more. And she talks about her 11-year-old who appears to still have sympathy and empathy. I guess mother hasn't beat it out of him yet. I'm watching the preteen respond to that by trying to make her happy. And I have had to actively tell him, stop trying to make her feel better. stop responding to her tears. My God, that's cold. My God, that's cold. It's not bad enough for this little girl that her mother won't respond and comfort her, but her 11-year-old brother is not allowed to. He's chastised for comforting her. Have a thought for this girl. Have a thought for her. Mommy says, it's interesting to see the conditioning of people responding to white girl tears happening so early. She's 5, and she's got an 11-year-old coming after her trying to make her feel better when she cries. We have to unlearn this whole business that white women crying is going to get them what they want in life, because that ain't it. Wow. This woman is stone dead inside. The cruelty and the coldness. How do you look at a child and have those emotions? This is not normal. And I saw a few people talking about this. Well, I saw many people talking about it. And a lot of people said, this is what wokeness does. This is what it does to people. And I understand where they're coming from, but I don't think it's quite that. I suspect this woman, has an abusive personality. Wokeness did not do this to her. She was like this to begin with. I don't think you can take a person with a normal level of emotion, a normal level of empathy, and a normal way of relating to other people, and turn them into a cold, neglectful at best, and frankly, hostile parent to a 5-year-old crying. You can't take a normal person, give them an ideology, and then just have them sign up for that. That's not usually how it works. I think wokeness, I think critical race theory, I think critical racial consciousness, and I think our public discourse has created a stage on which this woman's abusive personality can display itself. This is a socially acceptable, to some degree, this is a socially acceptable way for her to be abusive. And it reminded me of all things, Karen Carpenter. Karen Carpenter. Some of you won't know. I'm at the age now where I'm old enough that when I talk about things, I do actually have to give some signposts for people who are younger than me, because she was part of my childhood and not some of yours. If you don't know who Karen Carpenter was, Karen Carpenter was one of a brother-sister musical duo called the Carpenters, Karen and Richard Carpenter. Sensational pop act in the 70s. And Karen Carpenter's voice is one of the most unbelievably pure, melodic, emotional, conversational female singing voices you will ever hear in your life. If you have never heard Karen Carpenter sing, look her up now. Listen to her. When they were popular, the Carpenters, and they were very, very popular, but they were also the butt of jokes because they were corny, they were wholesome. They're AM radio easy listening. This is the stuff that was on the AM radio in the Ford Pinto or the Ford Maverick when my mother was driving us around when I was a little kid. It's easy listening. And this was an era when stadium rock, folk rock, and hard rock during the 70s were taking cultural ascendancy. So people picked at the Carpenters, they made fun of them, and they looked a little doofy. They looked like they were wearing outfits that they were modeling for a Mormon version of the JCPenney catalog, right? There was no overt sexuality. It was very wholesome. It was very sweet. But Richard Carpenter is a musical genius, an absolutely genius arranger and pianist. He arranged all of their music, not only the instrumental arrangement, but the multi-tracking, in mixing of their vocals to create a very distinctive sound. And Karen Carpenter had a voice that was unparalleled, and she died. I know, I went a little astray with the story. Here's the point of the story. Karen Carpenter died in 1983 of anorexia. She had been an anorexic for years, and people watched her turn into a skeleton on live television. It was incredibly sad. She was 32 or... Sorry, I do actually get a little emotional thinking about this. She was 32 or 33 when she died. And a lot of people don't know this, but I think that Karen Carpenter did not die really of anorexia. Anorexia and complications from anorexia physically killed her, but they were the proximate cause. I think Karen Carpenter died for lack of her mother's love. I've read a lot about them, read biographies, watched the documentaries, and Karen's mother, Agnes, strikes me as a very cold, withholding woman who is reported to have refused during her entire life to ever say the words, "I love you," to her daughter. Agnes Carpenter favored Richard. Richard was the one who displayed prodigal musical talent very early in the family. They did not discover that Karen had a voice from God until later. And Karen started out as a drummer. Richard was on his way to being a pianist and a performer, and they started a group together. And when people heard Karen sing, she was a virtuoso drummer, but they pushed her out in front of the stage and they said, "You have something that no one else has." And it was very uncomfortable for Karen. She was not comfortable in the spotlight. And her mother gave no encouragement and often treated her as if the attention that she was getting for her talent was dimming her favored son, Richard's star. There's a story from the last couple of years of Karen's life. She was recovering from anorexia in fits and starts and backsliding. There was a family therapy session in which it was reported that the therapist said to Agnes Carpenter as she sat in the room, "I think what's happening here, your daughter really needs to hear that her family loves her." And Richard said, "Karen, I love you. Of course I love you." And Agnes wouldn't say it and made some excuse about, "I'm a Northern Yankee. We don't do things like that." That is where it started. When you withhold love from a child, when you punish them, whether overtly or by being undemonstrative, by not encouraging them, you create an emptiness inside a child that they will try to fill with something. They will try to find some way to control their emotional world. For some people, it's addictions, alcoholism, eating disorders. Karen was a traumatized girl who never got the love that she was entitled to from her mother. I don't know very much about the father. He doesn't show up in a lot of these things. He was there, but people don't talk about him. I don't know what his responsibility was. But that's what this made me think of. And again, it may be obvious to many of you, but when you see a relationship like this, where a parent can't give or won't give the natural love to the child, that child, think about where they're headed, because it isn't any place good. And it's a place that I spent many decades in before I pulled myself out. Come back after the break. We're going to talk about the big lie and the duper's delight. See you on the other side. Make sure to subscribe to Disaffected on your favorite streaming audio platform so you can take us along for the ride. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and almost anywhere else you get your podcasts. Welcome back. Let's talk about the big lie. I'm going to read you a little bit from Wikipedia to set this up. The big lie is a gross distortion or misrepresentation of the truth used especially as a propaganda technique. The German expression was coined by Adolf Hitler when he dictated his 1925 book, Mein Kampf, to describe the use of a lie so colossal that no one would believe that someone could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Yep. The big lie is an infamous distortion of the truth. And so much of what we are swimming in right now, the culture that we are told we live in, the white supremacist culture, the misogynist culture, the transphobic culture, this is a big lie. These are not fundamentally characteristic of American culture. But the big lie works because most of us, most normal people, most stable people, most sane people assume that other people are normal, stable, and sane. But some are not. There is a measurable minority percentage of the population who are unstable, who live lies, live in lies, live by lies, and live through lies. This minority does not have a conscience the way you do. They don't have empathetic feeling for fellow humans the way you do, and they certainly don't have sympathy for them. We call these people dictators, authoritarians, tyrants, psychopaths, cluster Bs. They're out there, and they're in the ascendancy today. I want to show you a picture that is a big lie. So we put up on the screen here. You are looking at a photograph of a male weightlifter, a power weightlifter, standing in front of a background with a huge barbell, or maybe it's a dumbbell. A barbell, I guess. Well, if I'm wrong, you'll correct me. This is Laurel Hubbard. She used to be Gavin, but she transitioned. And what I want you to notice about this, he's standing there in a singlet that's made out of Lycra, body hugging, as athletes often do. And you can see his genitals. You can see his male genitals. That's a big lie. Laurel Hubbard. This is an infamous lie. Put out by someone impudent enough to distort the truth so infamously. You have in front of you an obvious man, well over 6 feet tall, 43 years old, standing in clothes tight enough to show the outline of his male genitalia, and the entire media complex is telling you that this is a woman named Laurel Hubbard. Right in front of your face, where you can see his dick and balls. Infamous, isn't it? And you know what? Laurel Hubbard is now New Zealand's pick to represent women's weightlifting at the is it this year? Is it 2021 or 2022 Tokyo Olympics? Yeah. And there's a 21-year-old woman, a weightlifter, who is actually the female champion weightlifter in New Zealand, who's not going to the Olympics because this 43-year-old man that we are told is a woman is going to be the first open transgender person to compete at the Olympics. Isn't that happy? And we put up with it. Maybe you don't. I don't. But enough people do. People aren't screaming in sufficient numbers that this is a lie. This is an example of the big lie. They say something so contrary to the truth, something so obvious, so obviously false, that you are left dumbstruck. You don't know how to react. Let me show you some other examples. This next one here I'm going to put up on the screen is a tweet from James Lindsay, the mathematician. I've spoken about him before, who's been doing yeoman's work against critical race theory getting into public school curriculums. And he gets, the amount of stick this man gets is unbelievable. He's a real threat to the critical race theorists because he's got their number. And he's right. He says that this is Marxist. It is Marxist. It absolutely comes from Marxian school of thought. You can trace it all the way back academically. And they're trying to pass it off as simply anti-racism. It's not. It's Marxist. It's collective. It's communist. And it's about power. These people want power. They dress it up as care and concern for oppressed people and people of color, but it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with power. So this tweet says, it shows some images of a school book, a book, I think, to educate teachers called Intersectional Allies. Intersectionality is I hesitate to call it a theory. It's a statement or an assertion by a critical race postmodern scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw that says that discrimination doesn't happen just on one axis. It's not if you're a woman, then you're oppressed merely because you're a woman. She gives the example of saying, but if you're a black woman, you have to contend not only with the sexist discrimination that will happen to you because you're a woman, but the racist discrimination that happens to you as a black woman. So these things intersect. And that idea on its face is not lunatic, right? There is something to be said for looking at the various ways that a person could be put in a disadvantaged position, and it might come from more than one direction. That's not obviously crazy, right? But it's been inflated well beyond her original formulation, and with her approval, by the way. Although she fights this and she objects to it, and she calls people like James racist. I don't think she said that exact word, but the implication is there. So James puts up a tweet that says, remember when Kimberly Crenshaw went on Joy Ann Reid's show, that's Joy Ann Reid, the MSNBC host, the other day, and said she would know if critical race theory was being taught in K through 12 schools, and that it isn't. She lied. This book is being used in some schools. Kimberly Crenshaw wrote the foreword, and he shows an image of the book Intersectional Allies. Yes, this is the big lie. They're all on it right now. People like Kimberly Crenshaw, people like Joy Ann Reid, people like Mark Lamont Hill saying, that's not critical race theory. And if it is, it's not being taught in schools. That's not it. You don't even know what you're talking about. You don't even know what critical race theory is. Anything to distract people from the truth. It's right there. It's in their papers. It's in their books. It's in the school curricula. They're literally this. The big lie. It would be as if somebody said to you that when the sun comes out, the world is dark. That's how the big lie works. They can literally invert reality. They can tell you the opposite of the truth, and not just the opposite of the truth, the opposite of what you can directly perceive with your own senses. They say the opposite is true, and it strikes you dumb. You don't know how to react because you can't believe someone would say this. And it destabilizes you. It makes you question whether you've lost your mind. It's closely related to what we call gaslighting. How could so many people be saying that I can't see this when I think I can? Is there something wrong with my eyes? Am I making things up in my head? That's the point. But there's another point to the big lie. It's not just to destabilize you. I'm going to go on to the next image to show you here. A couple of responses to James Lindsay's tweet. Man says, and the lie isn't there for cover. It's an obvious, easily refuted lie. It's there to demonstrate that the cultural revolutionaries can act without accountability to anyone. Yes, that is the purpose of the big lie. One more from the same guy, because he put it so well. Like a bully who steals your bike and then tells you he didn't while he's sitting on it. The whole point is to humiliate you and demonstrate your powerlessness to do anything. Yes, that is the whole point, and that is what they are doing. That is what they are doing when they tell you that Gavin Hubbard is a woman. That is what they do when they tell you that your emotional problems that brought you to therapy is your unaddressed white supremacy. That is what they are doing when they call the character and mind of white people as fundamentally psychopathic, that their souls are fundamentally corrupted. And then when they tell you that they're not saying that, or they're not teaching this theory, or it's just this, it's not that, they are confident enough to go out in public on social media and on mainstream media and lie about something that you can see with your own eyes. And the point is to tell you that they have the power to do it and that nothing bad is going to happen to them for lying. They get a thrill out of this. They like seeing you destabilized. There was a famous experiment in 1951 called the Asch Conformity Experiment, ASCH. And what the researchers did was they got a group of people together and they wanted to test what the average person would do in a situation where other members who were taking the test along with them made a false statement about something everybody could see. They wanted to know whether people would give the correct answer or whether they would also make a false statement out of social conformity. So I don't know if they had more than this in the test, but one of them was putting a series of line drawing, just lines, straight lines in front of people of different lengths. And they asked the study participants to, out of, say, 4 or 5 different line segments on a piece of paper, which is the shortest of the 5 lines. And what they had done was they had planted a few people among the survey takers who were actually colluding with the researchers. This is it's sneaky, but psychological research has to be sneaky. You have to be able to alter the conditions to see what happens. So these participants were instructed to lie. They were instructed to say that one of the lines that was longer was actually the shortest of the 5 lines. And what they found in this experiment was that a sizable minority of people, after they observed others in their social group pick the wrong one, they too would say that's the shortest line when it was not. They didn't do it every time, and it wasn't everybody who did it. But a significant minority of people, a significant portion of the time, would give the wrong answer to something they could see right in front of them because they saw other people do it. That's the big lie. That's gaslighting. Television shows have done this in less formal ways. If you're a fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation, you may remember the very famous episode where Captain Picard is kidnapped by a hostile alien race, and he's kept in a gulag, and he's tortured. And in one scene, he's sitting in a room with his captors, and they put on 5 lights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, shining on him. And their goal is to break him and make him say that there are 4 lights when there are clearly 5. And I don't remember the scene in great detail, but the ending of this scene, it's a very powerful scene, was Captain Picard really on the cusp of being psychologically and physically broken, screaming, "There are 4 lights." I think I reversed the number, whether it was 4 or 5. But he told the truth. There are 4 lights. There was another one I saw a few years ago. It was a show in the style of candid camera, hidden camera, and they had constructed a scene, an artificial scene. It was a doctor's office waiting room. And real people came in, people who were really patients of the practice, but what they did not know was that some of the other people sitting in that waiting room were plants who were there to further the experiment. And what they did was every few minutes, a chime would go off over the public address system. Bing bong. And the plant, the one who looked like a patient but was actually working with the researchers, whenever she heard the chime, she would stand up. Now think about how strange that is, right? You hear a chime, and she sets her book down and stands up, stands there for a couple seconds and sits back down. So they repeated this over and over again with their hidden camera. And sure enough, other people, real people who had no idea that they were in an experiment, they would first look over at this woman and wonder why she was doing that. But they wouldn't say anything. But you could see a quizzical look on their face. And after it happened enough times, they started doing it too. Bing bong, stand up. Amazing. I don't know what explains this, but it seems to be a feature of human psychology. We can be induced to lie or to affirm a lie out of social conformity. And I'm sure that evolutionary psychologists have worked out many of the possibilities here. It's very likely that there's some kind of evolutionary benefit to be had by individuals who are willing to go along with social norms. I'm sure that in our past, that quality helped aid survival. But as most traits, most psychological traits that we inherit from our evolved past are, they are double-edged swords. And as much as they may have helped our survival in the past, they can be used to exploit us in the present when we're not aware of them. And the big lie can be over something very, very small. And this is where it becomes very pertinent to your personal life. If you've got someone in your life who is telling the big lie, you might get caught in it. When I was a child, there were certain areas of our house that we children were not allowed to go to, or places we weren't allowed to touch. We weren't allowed to make messes. My mother was allowed to make messes. She had certain designated mess zones of the house. Her bedroom was off limits. You were never allowed to go into her bedroom unless she specifically gave you permission or gave you an order to go into her bedroom and get a very specific item. You are not to open any other drawers. You are not to look at anything in her room. Like all kids, I disobeyed sometimes, but I never went in her bedroom. I knew what would happen if I did without her permission. So she had her bedroom, and a lot of times the dining room table would be a repository for her mess, and weeks, months, sometimes years of unopened mail. Yes, years worth of bills would get piled up on the dining room table in these precarious, messy heaps. And you could never suggest that anything should be organized because you get, I know where everything is, I have a system, right? Some of you may know a person like this. We couldn't touch that pile of papers. We couldn't move them to put something else down on the table. But as you can imagine, being disorganized in this way, my mother frequently lost track of important documents and important possessions. And as soon as she couldn't find something, she came to us. What did you kids do with my hairbrush? What did you do with the electric bill? Nothing. But we paid for it. It had to be our fault. It had to be our fault. And this happened over and over. And we'd say, Mommy, I promise I didn't go. Somebody went into my bedroom because I never leave my hairbrush anyplace else. And if you don't tell me the truth, you're going to get it. And I got it. And my sister got it. And my brother got it. But at times, I began to believe that I must have taken the electric bill, that I must have misplaced the hairbrush. And I started questioning myself. Am I doing this and not remembering? Because she's convinced that I did it and she can't find it. I don't remember doing it, but she's so insistent. Was I sleepwalking? Was I in some sort of fugue state? I started to question myself, even as a child, wondering if I were losing my mind, if I were doing things I couldn't remember doing. This can happen to you when you've got somebody around you who's gaslighting you or telling you the big lie. Even if you can see it with your own eyes or you can't see it, you don't trust your own senses anymore. And it got to the point right before the big rupture where I finally put my mother out of my life that I had a notebook and I started to write down things that I did with dates on them so that I could go back and check, because I felt like I was starting to lose my mind. Did I do that? Did I not do that? I couldn't tell anymore. So people who live with people like this, or people who work with people like this, you can see this behavior in bosses sometimes. It can be very psychologically destabilizing. So what I would say to you, how do you deal with this? It's hard, but you do have to deal with it, and you do have to face it head on. Write things down. Talk to other people. Test reality with friends. Say to somebody, what does this look like to you? Did I hear this correctly? Do you see the same thing that I saw? Don't let people tell you the big lie and strike you dumb. Don't be the person who stands up when the chime goes off just because the woman next to you did it. Tell yourself the truth, reality test with other people, and call liars liars. I'll see you next week. Have a story idea? A tip? A question? A comment? We want to hear from you. You can reach us at disaffected.fm or call our listener line at 202-979-2480. Remember, we reserve the right to play calls on the air.